Hey, good morning, Mater. How are you? Can you hear me? No.
Have you started it yet?
About 2 minutes.
Okay, that's what I said.
Who was that?
Maria wrote her hair.
Oh, good.
She
Okay. Did she have the link?
She says, I can't get on. I said, it hadn't started yet.
Well, I mean, she can get in there. There's other people in there now waiting. So,
Well, I
Yeah.
said it started at 11. So if you start it and she doesn't show up, let me know and I'll call her back.
no, all right. Hey, everyone. Good morning. Can you guys hear me? If you can, just raise your hand or say hello. You'd have to unmute yourself. Hey, Joyce, good morning. How are you? I think your mic is off. I think you need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Right. I'm doing great. How are you?
Hey, Miss Diane,
Hey there.
did I get my paperwork in correctly?
I don't know. I haven't. I thought I'd give you a heads up on just that one and thought I let her get ahead of that.
I was trying to be so good.
Well, you were. It was perfect. Good luck.
Thank you.
I got an eye on you too.
Yeah, exactly.
How are you, Diane? I haven't seen you in a while.
No, why didn't you stop by, Joyce? What's happening?
It's just not on my beaten path these days, but I'll come over.
Thank you. Okay, I'll be looking for you.
Okay.
Yeah, we were talking that I think we want to have like a, like a summer gathering. Well, maybe not a summer before it gets too hot, but maybe like, end of month or 1st of June and evade Miss Diane's office and take it over and have a little open house over there. I
That'd be
think that
great.
would be fun.
Mhm.
Perfect.
You say that now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that'll be fun.
Yeah. Well, we've got 11:01 and I want to go ahead and get started. Sorry. I want to go ahead and get started. And, today we have a topic that creates a lot of controversy. But I'm happy to talk about it because I think that when you can talk and debate things out, we all come to a better understanding of the why, who, and how of the situation. And I think that's one of the things that I always want to accomplish on these calls, is to just have a better understanding. I'm one of the things that I find very, very interesting is that in the purchase and sale agreement, there's a little tiny paragraph that the GAR form committee put in that all of these agreements are subject to interpretation. And for as long as I can remember, my thought was that contracts were pretty much black and white. Begin date, end date, everybody agrees to the terms, and that's your contract. I never really considered interpretation until, you start trying to fight for earnest money, or you start trying to discuss with a buyer's agent why we have a lead-based paint form on our listings. And it can be difficult, and sometimes you're going to get that pushback, sometimes you're not. The bottom line is, we took the stance at Chapman Hall Companies and Crest to incorporate the lead-based form into our listing agreements as a further protection of the seller. And I've talked to agents where the sellers actually push back on it. Excuse me, I got to cut this thing down. It'll go off all afternoon. Okay, where the sellers actually push back and they say, well, I don't want to sign that. It's, my house was built after 78, and then you launch into your routine. But the bottom line is all we're trying to do is to protect the seller. And it's just simply a disclosure. And it's so controversial. I don't get that part sometimes. It's very simple. But one of the things that I did find, and it's up on the board right now, is this is in the GAR forms. I found it very interesting. I had not really paid attention to it before, but it's the U.S. Code Title 42, Chapter 63A, Section 4852D, disclosure of information concerning lead upon transfer of residential property or transfer of real property. Sometimes you hear that form. And, this is a form that basically goes through and just explains, why it's important to disclose it. They changed the rules back in 92 and promulgated, I might not have said that right, a lot of, the current rules and regs that we're beholden to, not only at a state level with our licensing, but also at a federal level. So, it's just good to have this in your toolbox and understand it. And basically this section that I've highlighted, it's all about the purchaser. It's about informing the purchaser of the possibility that, it could be an environmental issue within the property. So let's talk for a moment about why it's important now. And my response has always been, and I think I've even said it on this meeting before, is that everybody can go online and they can order anything from around the world and probably have it overnight. It depends. But that includes stuff like vintage mantles, reclaimed barn wood. Some people like to do the country thing and go, with like old-timey sleds or old-timey utensils as decorations and stuff. And granted, it's not a fixture by any way, shape, or form, but it could contaminate the environment with lead. So I'm not saying you have to disclose, decorated items, but a fireplace mantle, reclaimed wood as shiplap siding or decoration, or even in the floors sometimes, there is a distinct possibility that it came about in a time when there were no lead-based paint rules, and everything was lead-based paint. And, that goes back, gosh, to the 20s, to the 1800s, and it was quite prolific in society as, paint until, it kind of went to a water base, which was not that long ago. And if you kind of stand back and look at it, it's can contaminate the environment as well. So just simply informing your seller of why we're doing it, whether they agree to it or not, you want to have that discussion with them. One of the things, and it's not up to the listing agent or the seller to do it, it is strictly up to the buyer's agent to provide the purchaser or lessee, because this also applies to rentals, with a lead hazard information pamphlet. Those are in the GAR forms. Disclose to the purchaser or lessee the presence of any known lead-based paint or any known lead-based paint hazards in such housing, and provide the purchaser or lessee any lead hazard evaluation report available to the seller or lessee. That's when it goes a little deeper. That's definitely a house built prior to 78, where you would probably want to have it inspected and have a lead-based paint test done. And then to permit the purchaser, this is where the seller has to get on board, a 10-day period, unless mutually agreed upon a different period of time, to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint hazards. You can't deny it. It's not part of due diligence. It's entirely separate. And it goes on further to say that they're conducting the inspection to determine if they want to move forward with the agreement. So let's just say worst case scenario, they do an assessment that comes back and there's lead-based paint. Who's responsible for mediating that? Well, it's not going to be the buyer. So there goes your deal right down the hole. But now you have a bigger problem. You've got a lead-based situation, which we now have to disclose and which we now probably have to remediate. And your seller's not happy about that. So it can open a can of worms, but it can also give a peace of mind. And you just have to take that on a case-by-case basis. If you're looking at, into creating a listing on a house built prior to 78, you've got to pay special attention. Maybe even encourage the seller to have their own lead-based paint hazard inspection done. And then that way you can kind of like stop it at the door before it gets out to a purchaser or gets, a little crazy or out of control. Any questions or comments on that anybody wants to share their experiences, and good or bad? I want to hear everything on dealing with this particular disclosure. And just unmute your microphone. If it's got a red slash through it, you're muted. So we're all on the same page here. We're all in agreement. Give me a thumbs up. Wave your hands. Okay, thank you. Thanks, guys. Okay, so further in this agreement, it's not even an agreement, it's just information. You move down here, contents of lead warning statement, compliance assurance. It talks about the regulations on there, the promulgation. I didn't say that right. And then again, down to penalties for violators, monetary penalties. Any person who knowingly violates any provision of the section shall be subject to civil monetary penalties in accordance with the provisions of section 3545 of this title. So I've heard people throw all kinds of numbers out there, that it was 16,000 or it was 25,000. In my humble opinion, I think the fine is 16,000 per violation for, it would be for the broker, it would be against an agent, and it would be against the seller if this ever came about. And it has, or we wouldn't have all these rules. Further in here on the civil liability, this is interesting. Any person who knowingly violates the provision of this section shall be jointly and severally liable to the purchaser of the lessee, purchaser of lessee, in an amount equal to 3 times the amount of damages incurred by such individual. So a civil liability, if it actually went to a court, they could charge you 30,000 or 60,000, and again, it's kind of unknown. However, when we drop down into prohibited act, this last sentence, it says it shall not be more than 10,000. So again, there's some controversy there. I took a minute to research it. I could not get a definitive answer. So that tells me that, the regulators probably have their own formula for calculating that. But on this particular section under prohibited act, it's about a Toxic Substance Control Act. It doesn't necessarily say lead-based paint. Okay, so that's why, again, it's up for interpretation. Further, it goes on, and I think this is important because I've had this question, is even if the property does have a lead-based paint hazard on it, it's nothing in the sections shall affect the validity or enforceability of any sale or contract for the purchase and sale or lease of any interest in residential real property or any loan agreement, mortgage, or lien made or arising in connection with a mortgage loan, nor shall anything in this section create a defect in a title. So having said that, the way that I interpret it is that, you can have your inspections done, you can fight tooth and nail to figure out who's going to pay for remediation, whether it's done or not, but it's never going to create a cloud on a title, and it's never going to prevent you from transferring real property as long as all parties agree to the end result. So I found that to be very interesting that, hey, it's out there, but we're not going to prohibit trade, I guess is another way of looking at it. So that is just the detail in the title 42. It's not really even rules and regs, other than the fact that the purchaser or lessee needs to receive these pamphlets and disclosures. Okay? It's up to the listing agent to make sure that the buyer's agent provides it. And if they don't, you need to protect your seller. Okay? Plus, they have an uninhibited 10-day period to conduct a property before the contract moves forward. So any questions on this while I switch out to the actual form? I'm listening. Let's talk about it. Nobody? Gosh, you guys are quiet today. Okay. Look, I'm getting so good at this. Aren't you proud of me? Okay. So here's the regular disclosure. And again, it's a one-page form. The one thing that I want to say that is probably very typical of using this form is that the seller, you're going to put your property address in, that's obvious. The seller is going to initial in two places, B right here, and they're going to check either the seller has no knowledge or the seller has no reports, even if it was built prior to 78. If the seller has no knowledge, then the seller cannot make something up that they don't know. Okay. So typically they're going to initial here or check here, and initial here on B. Now, if they do have knowledge, or let's say that vintage man.
It's Maria again. You sent me one on lead-based paint that I've already.
Okay. So having said that, sorry about that. So let's just say that there is an issue or whatever. There's the mantelpiece, there's the shipwreck siding, whatever's going on. It wouldn't hurt for the seller just to say that they have no known knowledge. However, the shipwreck siding was bought, on Amazon, or the vintage mantelpiece was bought on eBay, and they have no known knowledge, but it's remaining with the property. More is better. If you can get them to do it, great. If you can't, just go with what your seller says. Sometimes you just have to have faith in the seller. The purchaser. Now, this is important. It protects the seller particularly. Like I said, when we started out, I said when we started out that, you're going to get pushback from buyer's agents and purchasers that don't want to sign it. But, it's really quite harmless, because if I were buying a house, I would want to know every single solitary detail, on a resale property. So purchaser's acknowledgement, they have to do a little bit more. They can initial either CD, and on E, they can select either one or both boxes. Well, one or the other box. And then even the agent's acknowledgement, and this is for the seller. So as the listing agent, you would even acknowledge your initials here on E. And again, certification of accuracy, disclaimer, to the best of their knowledge that the information provided is true and accurate. That's about as far as you can go. And here are the title obligations that we just went over. So it all ties it back together. And again, I'd love some participation. Give me some feedback on your experiences. Some of you have been in the business, as long as I have, and I know that something has come up at some point in your career that had to do with lead-based paint. So let's share a little bit before we go to the next one.
Well, Renee, I've had some pushback on this from agents, and
Yeah.
I think we talked about this before. So I guess I didn't totally understand either that it was, products that could have been bought, and installed and not be bought under the regulations of lead base or whatever. But their objection seems to be that somehow and it's been particularly when I've sold a house and working with the buyer and asked for it that they haven't wanted. They don't, usually I haven't had anybody not want to sign it, as a buyer.
Mhm.
But it's if I'm working with the buyer.
Yeah. Have you had any sellers say that they didn't want to sign
No,
it? Okay.
no.
Yeah. And again, it just amazes me sometimes that a lot of time our clients don't understand why we're working on their behalf.
Well, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but when you
Okay.
asked me if I'd had a seller, not the
Yeah.
seller that I'm representing, it's the seller, it's I'm working with the buyer and the seller of the property doesn't want to sign. And the agent in several cases has said they feel like it puts an obligation on the seller that they don't need to have for some reason. I don't know. It puts them at risk somehow.
Yeah. And again, that's why we really, on the buy side, disclosure, caveat emptor, it's all about the buyer's discovery of the property, right? So I would hope that my buyer's agent would be competent and smart enough to bring this up with the seller. But again, it just amazes me because the seller would carry the weight of responsibility, probably as much, if not more, than the broker would.
Yeah.
And it's just simply about, doing and being the best fiduciary for your client that you can be.
Well, anyway, sometimes we get this thing with sellers where they think, well, if I disclose this, then I'm responsible, for having to fix it or having to do something about it if I disclose it. So maybe there's that they think, well, if I sign this, then I'm signing away my right to negotiate this if something came up. I don't know if that's their mindset, but it seems to be sometimes.
It could be, and it could also be a reason that it was just poorly explained to them that it's actually a benefit for them, to have this disclosure. And, it's a lot easier to say, I didn't know and have the disclosure than to say, I didn't know, but I didn't want to sign anything because I didn't want to be responsible for it.
That's it.
And sellers are like that. They're selling the house. They don't want to put any money into it. They just want to move on. But aside from moving out of the country, this can always come back to get you. I mean, it could be 3 or 4 sales down the road. And if there's a broken chain of seller acknowledgement, whether it was prior to 78 or not, and something does appear, then they could go all the way back to where that chain was originally broken. That's what Seth Weissman told me. So
maybe there's also a concern about the time that it would take. Everybody's always in a hurry to get it closed, and maybe they're concerned about the time it would throw into the mix if,
I think it's interesting. I think it would be an interesting question to throw out to a seller that was pushing back on signing it, other than like new construction. That's never going to happen. But new construction is new construction. It doesn't have vintage fireplaces and stuff like that in it typically. But anyway, my point being is, they're more easily agreeable to a mold remediation or a mold or a termite issue than they are about a lead-based paint hazard. Well, as far as I know, there's not any federal fines against mold or termite infestation on a property that are promulgated and regulated like these are. So I find it fascinating that it creates such a stir.
So I'm curious, I have never sold a home that a buyer has done a lead paint evaluation on. Has anybody dealt with that, and what happens and what does it cost and who do you even call?
Great question.
well, most of the time they say encapsulate. You know, they don't say to go in and scrape it all off. It's encapsulate is what they, isn't
So
it?
who do you call? Who do you call
Well,
for that
painter.
inspection?
Painters, I guess.
Well, let me ask you this, because I think that's a great question. You know that company out there, Rhino Shield?
Yeah.
And there is a ceramic paint. It doesn't have to be Rhino Shield, but there's a ceramic paint that you can buy, you know, like on those antebellum houses that are so prolific throughout the city. I wonder if you were to encapsulate it, that would be a protection with like that ceramic paint or something. I mean, it's very expensive, but it does encapsulate it, you
So
know?
Renee, what are you seeing with other agents? I've sold some houses built prior to 1978, but nobody has ever done a lead inspection. So if I was helping a buyer buy a house built in 1960, what are you seeing happens, and what happens if they find there's lead paint? I mean, does this happen, or this is all sort of hypothetical?
A bit of both, Rhonda. It's a bit of both. If I were representing a buyer that was buying a house prior to 1978, I would make sure the inspector that I hired included a lead-based paint inspection, just like a radon or whatever. I know that Max at MPI does it. And further, if it is discovered, you know, I would immediately want to have a conversation with the listing agent or the seller and find out a solution to this, or I would move on. You know, if a seller's not willing to address an issue that could be so serious above and beyond mold or termites, I don't think I could, you know, respectfully, you know, help a buyer buy a property like that. And I know that's maybe a crazy thing to say, but sometimes that's what we're there for, is to make the right decisions for the buyer, or help them make the right decision.
Are you seeing contracts being terminated one time a year, 20 times a year?
I would say maybe once or twice total per year. I mean, we do quite a lot of volume, whereby they fill out, and in mostly over inspection. The one or two that I saw was based on remediation of both lead-based paint and mold and termites. It should have been a tear down for all intents and purposes. And it was out in Gwinnett, somewhere, like, you know, north of 985 area, but still in Gwinnett. And it probably should have been a tear down, but these folks wanted it. And they just, when it came down to it, it was just going to be too much more money to put into the renovation on top of all the remediation. And the seller simply refused to do it. You know, there's a lot of occasions where the seller doesn't have to do that, and the seller doesn't have to sell the house because of that. You will find yourself in situations like, usually on like legacy properties, you know, that maybe have been passed down, farmland with barns and stuff like that on it. I mean, sometimes the lead-based paint is not necessarily conducted inside the home. It could be a shed on the property. It could be a lean-to that was built with something reclaimed or whatever. I mean, they check everywhere when they do the inspection. And you know, that's a great idea. What I should have done today was had Max on here to talk about it a little bit, and how he does his lead inspection. I'm going to make a note and get him back on here one day with us, because I think it's a topic that we probably need to talk about more and more, you know, and how we would overcome it. But just to give you a down and dirty answer on your question would be, have the inspection done and then fight tooth and nail to get it remediated by the seller, and or convince the buyer to move on, that this was not the property to them, especially if they have children.
Yeah.
You know, small children, and I don't know because I don't have kids, but will chew or eat anything apparently. So,
Well, that's what makes me wonder about encapsulation, because you're not getting rid of it. You're just covering it up.
yeah, agree. You know, I've heard that a lot. Well, we'll tell you this one situation that came across, this wasn't this year. I think this was last year or the year before in the middle of COVID or something. But anyway, the basement had a parquet, a fake parquet tile floor down there. And a couple of the parquet tiles had come up, and part of the contract was that the seller agreed to put LVP flooring in and have the parquet pulled up. Well, when the LVP flooring people showed up to do the install, they wouldn't do it because there was asbestos parquet tiles down.
Mm.
And because a few of them had been pulled up, they said had released it, and they couldn't go in and encapsulate it.
Mhm.
That they were talking that it would have to be the entire basement would have to be, like you said, encapsulated, remediated, removed, cleaned. Then the flooring could go in. And the seller's like, I'm not paying for that. And the buyer's, I'm not paying for that. And, and the deal fell apart. But that was asbestos. So I agree with Joyce. I kind of like want to treat it the same way because it's just as dangerous, with the asbestos on a fake parquet tile floor versus, putting an LVP over it. That company, and I'll tell you who it was that Empire Today company that came in to do the LVP flooring. They wouldn't do it. They just said, no, we cancel the job. We're not doing this. There's asbestos. What do you do there? So I don't know. I never went back and followed up to see if the house ever went back on the market. But the thing is, and I'm not saying we were on the buy side of it, and I'm not saying anything about the listing agent, but sometimes, major stuff will come up like that. They just throw it back on the market and hope that the next person that comes in, doesn't want to go that deep of a dive and to real issues with the home. And that's kind of frightening to me. I don't know. So interesting.
Do you recommend pre-inspections?
With the seller, yeah, I kind of do. I recommend pre-appraisals and I recommend pre-inspections because here's the thing, knowledge is power.
Right.
And the last thing that you want to get hit with is a really good cash offer, close in 10 days, but they want to do, like super inspections on it. And then all the stuff comes up and it either falls apart or you end up giving tons of concessions away. So, I think you should recommend it always and try to convince them why they need it. It's up to the seller to make that investment, honestly. But it would certainly protect you as far as the agent goes, and you would have full knowledge of what was going on with the property and not necessarily relying on a seller. In these days and times, and certainly right now, listings hit the market and they're gone in 48 hours again. I mean, it's happening. It's happening every day now. So you really don't have time to do a deep dive. They call you up, they say, I want to list my home. The market's hot. You run over there, you get the listing agreement signed, you throw it out on the MLS, and sometimes you just cross your fingers and hope for the best. Maybe it's not the best representation you could do, but sometimes there's no time to get into it. But personally, yes, I would recommend it. Absolutely, without fail. Does anybody else recommend it or?
Well, I usually do, especially in the case of senior adults.
Good.
Especially if a widow owns the house and she never took care of anything, the husband always did it, or vice versa.
Right.
And, maybe they don't know, but they're still obligated to,
Right.
They're still obligated if something's found. So I usually do recommend it, and I try to get them to give me enough time, but you know, you couldn't get an estate to do it. They're not gonna do it.
Yeah, an estate or a trust
No,
would never do that.
no. Usually the state won't even agree on, you know, if there's several kids or whatever, they're not gonna agree on
Exactly.
something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a good idea. You know, I think it's a level of professionalism to recommend that. You know, it's always up to the seller to accept or deny it per se. But I think it's absolutely the right thing to do to recommend it. You know, I mean, I would just simply want to know as much as I could about the listing, so that you can market it accordingly. You know that the documents are right. And you know how you're going to head them off at the pass if anything major is out there. You know, it's just knowledge is power situation. So on this form, this is the seller sales side, and it's form number, not even on here. Where is it? It's not even on there. But there are two disclosures. So let's take a moment and talk about the other disclosure. I'm not going to pull it up because it's identical. Instead of purchaser, it says lessee, lessor, and lessee. So this is about the rental side of it. And same thing now, you know, if you take a listing for a rental, you're going to have the lead-based paint on there as well. A lot of times, you know, you'll get a tenant in, the tenant's not represented. All they're doing is renting the property. So the burden is going to fall upon you, the representative of the seller, to share this disclosure with them. And it is part of the rule. So if it's, you know, if it's like an Airbnb type thing, which we don't really do, or a short-term rental, you know, you're probably not going to do it, which it doesn't make it illegal if it's not after or prior to 78. But if it's a traditional lease and they're going to be in there like a year or more, then you need to provide the doc for them and get their initials as well. So here it would say lessor's disclosure and then lessee's acknowledgement. So those are the only changes. The verbiage is identical. It just changes the players to the thing. And I was kind of taken off guard until recently that it was even required. You know, I thought it was just based on the transfer of real property. I was wrong. You know, if somebody's going to be living in the house, it needs to be disclosed to them. So, you know, this whole thing, since we've really gotten into it over the last couple of years, and the whys and the why nots, has shed a lot of light on the importance of it, even the renters. You know, some people discount renters, but they're living in the property too. And, you know, they could bring an action against anybody. It's a very litigious society that we're living in. So, yeah, it's a little crazy. Anybody out there that's rented property that's provided the disclosure to a renter? Just unmute your, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty standard on any time selling or buying or leasing, even more so in a leasing scenario.
Hey, Alan, I recognize your voice. I can't see your face. Thanks for joining us. And you do quite a lot of that, of the rentals and everything. Have you ever had any issues come up or anything crazy?
No, never had anything come up, but I always make sure I emailed that pamphlet to the you know, the
The renter,
and
yeah.
make sure, and they always say, what is that? I say, well, we're required to give that to you. You need to read it, and you'll
Yeah.
be signing do that for the lease.
Yeah, and I agree with that. That's probably the least that you can do, but it's also probably the best thing to do as well, because at least you're putting it out there and you know, letting them be aware of it, that they have the same option to have you know, the property inspected as well. And I can honestly tell you, and Alan, you might correct me on this, is that I've never had a tenant do a home inspection. It just never occurred to me, but they would. But recently, I've seen quite a few come through in the paperwork. It's, agreement to address concerns on a rental. And it just goes to show you how savvy that the general public is becoming in all of this. And again, we need to stay on our toes and be up to date on all the latest stuff going on because it changes
Yeah,
constantly.
sometimes that happens, especially if the tenant is a higher end tenant and they come in with an agent. Maybe they're renting for $4,000.
Yeah.
They'll go ahead and do the inspection, all that, and sometimes those are harder than selling the house because the tenant's like, well, if I'm going to pay you $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 a month, we're going to have this thing in tip top shape, and the agent kind of hammers you home. So you really got to have all your stuff even more important there because you're kind of the attorney, the agent, the broker, and everything all together in one.
Mhm. I think that's a great scenario. Going back to what Joyce said a moment ago, is even on a lease, you might want to recommend that they get a pre-lease inspection, or head it off at the pass again, just to be prepared. So, yeah, a lot of liability, a lot of responsibilities.
And landlords are known for, doing the maintenance sometime proactively or many times never doing maintenance or never really they just want to get the most out of the property while they own it, right? So
Yeah.
landlords are probably the most susceptible to violations because they're just painting and painting and painting and not doing anything really to improve the property sometimes, depending on what type of property and landlord it is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good point. Because I've seen many landlords, in those houses, there's a lot of areas around Atlanta that have experienced a very quick renaissance. And, the houses were built in the 30s and 40s and they're slapping a coat of paint on it, trimming the bushes and throwing it out there. So for rent and for sale. So that's a really good point.
Well, if you put yourself in the place of the renter, they're signing something that says they can't do any kind of modifications to the house also.
Yeah.
So if they're giving, 2 months rent or 1 month's rent deposit, and then they're paying that much money and something comes up and the landlord refuses to fix it, they don't have the option, of calling in somebody as an emergency.
Yes.
I would do, I would look at it from that standpoint too.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And one other thought, if I get a landlord that will not supply something, which usually doesn't happen because you have a working relationship with them. But if I get a situation where someone's buying something and they're not willing to do a lead base or not willing to do a disclosure, all that, depending on the scenario, I'll go ahead and send a blank copy of this is what typically people use. It just covers me because I said, this is not part of this transaction, but I want you to know that a lot of people do get this type of disclosure.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's great because if you email it to them, then you have that paper trail, that as their fiduciary, you recommended that they do this, whether they choose to do so or not, is the burden falls upon them.
Yeah, and it gives them something to read and ask questions on if they're really concerned about. And they may not know that a lot of people don't know there's a lot of questions out there that they should be asking. So if it's not part of the transaction, I just make it available to them to say, these are things you could ask or push for, but it's not in this transaction. No one's giving you a disclosure.
Right. Right. Well, and we did seller's disclosure last week, and lo and behold, there's a disclosure for land, agricultural, there's a disclosure for rental, every kind of disclosure that you can think of that renters or landlords typically don't even use or are aware of. And, that falls upon the agent to make them, aware of everything that can protect them. I mean, they're going to have some culpability, obviously, if something goes really wrong. But if they don't know about it or ignorant of the situation, then, they can't really do anything about it. I mean, knowledge is power. So interesting topic. I like where we went with the renters on this. That was a little unexpected. And I'm glad you shared that, Alan. I thought it was great. And Joyce, thank you so much. Any more questions or anything else anybody would like to bring up with the forms or Title 42 US code on the whole shebang here, the lead warning statement and everything?
I guess I just need a clarification on something you said in the beginning when you were talking about furniture and stuff. And even though that furniture might be not staying in the house, that it has contaminated the area. Is that what you said?
Well, think about it. And again, it kind of goes back to what you said about seniors and homes that have lived there for 40 or 50 years. You stick a lead rooster on top of the cabinet in the kitchen and it stays there forever, or a lead sieve, or any kind of trinkets that came that are antiqued or vintage, and they sit up there and they stay there for years and years and years. There's got to be some kind of residue. I mean, everything starts to deteriorate, period. Everything deteriorates at a certain point. So I don't think that that's necessarily a requirement to disclose it. But I mean, I think it's something to consider if you walk in, to someone's house and you see all that stuff. My first response would be, let's wrap this up and get it out of there because, it's vintage and it could be a hazard. I don't have a problem telling a seller that. I tell my sellers to, take the kids' photographs down, all your personal stuff, put your jewelry in the bank, get the guns out of the house, everything. We're selling this. We are selling this and you are moving. Get this stuff out of here. So, as kind of part of that routine, a lot of that would be to declutter and eliminate that. I mean, you can't look at something and say, oh, well, that's lead or that has lead in it. I mean, you just don't know. But it's a 50-50 shot sometimes,
Particularly the industrial furniture. Everybody's wanting to use some, well, they're not now, but they were.
Well, you're right. Yeah, like those tables, those vintage tables that came out of factories and stuff that have been reconditioned because there's, it's kind of Brauhaus type of a design. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Stuff like that,
Okay.
If it's not staying and it's not tied down, then let's back it up. We're moving. It's hard to convince them to do that. I mean, even when a seller signs a listing agreement, they're not entirely sure that they're going to move. It's funny that they think that way, but sometimes they do, and then it's a scramble to get everything done. And another thing too is like if you're photographing a property and, let's just say by chance it's for whatever reason they have a valuable painting or a valuable artifact, you don't want that in the picture. You don't want that out there on Zillow. I'm just saying. So,
well, can I throw out a problem I have right now and see if anybody has a solution?
please do. Yes.
I'm getting ready to list a house that has a creek in the backyard.
Mm-hmm.
And years and years ago, there was a footbridge that was put over the creek and it has dilapidated. And that's what you see. It would be a beautiful view out the dining room window of the creek in the woods if you didn't see that creek, that dilapidated bridge.
Mhm.
I've looked and looked to try to help the seller find somebody to take it out. I don't know which direction to go. Does anybody have a suggestion?
Um, I think like maybe a handyman or something, like maybe one of those guys that do trees and stuff,
Mhm.
not an arborist, but,
Yeah.
but come and cut the trees down and haul all that stuff away.
They would have to have some pretty heavy equipment to
Yeah,
get it. It's not, you know, I,
it's not a
I
toy bridge.
other than seeing it from the window down there, but it's
Yeah.
it's a lot of debris.
Yeah. So is it beyond repair? It just needs to be hauled
Yeah,
up?
it needs to be hauled off.
I don't know, maybe like a tree service because they've got all that pulling and dragging and cutting equipment.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll suggest that then.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Are you guys ready to go out there and storm the world and take it over and sell a bunch of houses and close a bunch of deals? Because I
Absolutely.
know you are. It's Happy Tuesday today. All right, folks. Next week, we'll have another topic. I really enjoyed this, and I would want to take a moment and just say thank you to everyone that attends. I've gotten such positive feedback. It just makes me feel so good. I appreciate the debates and the discussions that we have in these, because I think I walk away with a little bit more knowledge than I had. Certainly what Alan brought up about the rentals, and I hope you guys too do as well. And I think it's a great forum. I really enjoy our Tuesdays together. So next week we'll have another topic, and I look forward to seeing everybody there. And once again, if you've got any questions or need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask away. So take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Renee.
you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.